so much for coming along to the final event of this year's Neurodiversity Celebration Week. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Yaz. I work in the teaching lab on Exeter University's Penryn campus, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for Cornwall Disability Network. We're a network that aims to provide community and support for staff and students across all of the Cornwall campuses, including Falmouth University, for anyone with a disability, a chronic illness, or caring responsibilities. Our network was very kindly approached by Lena and the LGBTQ+ network to co-host this event. So thank you so much to them for having us along in this conversation and for identifying this as an important intersectional issue. And I think now Lena is going to give a bit more information on the event and introduce our wonderful speaker. So thank you.
Thanks, Yaz. So as part of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, one of the things that's really come up a lot within the LGBT network and all of the prides we've done is this discussion around conversion therapy. It's really massive in the UK at the moment. And whenever we've discussed it, someone has brought up neurodiversity and the way that neurodivergent people are the victims of conversion therapy in much the same way as queer people. And often they're the same people because there's quite an overlap between the two communities. I know I'm part of both. So we were really keen to do an event. We looked around and tried to find a speaker who was an expert in this. And we found this amazing person called Jorik, who is a speaker, mentor, activist who's written some very interesting things on this subject in the past, and is also a Southwest local, so he's in our area, and we're just really thrilled and blessed to have him come and talk to us today. So yeah, we're just really happy you're here, Jorik. And as a note to people, we will be recording. This will be available on YouTube afterwards, hopefully, if all being well, all stars aligning. And if there's anything in this talk that is stressful for you or is a cause of trigger, feel free to drop out. I'll be monitoring the chat. I can let you know when things are back to being okay. If you let me know what to watch out for, we're here to help you. And hope you enjoy this event. So thank you, Jorik.
Thank you so much, Lena. Thank you, Yaz. Yes, welcome everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here. I'm really happy. I'm really proud to see you've all turned up. So let's make this the beginning of something good. As Lena said, I will be talking about conversion therapy, the limits of behaviorism, and how neurodivergence plays into it. Now, basic stuff here, content warnings for discussions of early death, trauma and abuse, violence, reactionary politics, institutional failure, and bad puns, which I always need to do a content warning for because they are the worst and the most traumatizing. So be that as it may, we're moving on.
I forgot to mention something, Jorik. Sorry.
Yes.
Mentimeter. You can, if people have questions during the chat and want to ask them anonymously, there is a Mentimeter. The link in the chat, and yeah, feel free to ask questions. Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, so I won't be able to see or hear any of your questions right now. Please turn off your microphones and cameras if you haven't already done so. Here we go. There we go. Warning, the views expressed during this training not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Exeter, its staff, or any contractor connected to the university. These views do however, reflect the views of the overwhelming majority of autistic activists and autistic people, not just online, but in the real world. These views reflect the most recent NES and NCHEST approved standards and the core capabilities framework of the government's new tiered training and education system on autism. They do not, however, reflect the current balance of power within the autism field. But well, the views expressed, wow, can we do that again? The views expressed reflect the life experience of myself and other members of my community. We are autistic adults who have managed to survive a very dangerous world and find small ways of being successful. So, what we're going to talk about, where is the line? Neurodivergence, conversion therapy. Answer, there is no line. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. And then we'll have a Q&A. Let's go through this. Now, I know many of you listening are yourselves autistic and or neurodivergent. And just to give you the TLDR, there is no line. Neurodivergent people are overwhelmingly LGBTQIA+. You will know this if you've ever set foot in an openly autistic space. We therefore make up a significant number of the LGBTQIA+ community. Our gender, sexuality, and neurotype are equally fundamental to who we are. Any behavioral intervention to make us any less than we are amounts to eugenics. That is why any ban on conversion therapy has to include its brand names, ABA, PBS, Team Teach, Teach, and other systems built on behavior modification therapy. Got that? Good. Now, let's do the same thing, but a little bit more methodical. This, because I'm a basic bitch in my 30s, I'm on LinkedIn. Recently, I've been seeing some memes with messages that have disturbed me. So yeah, the sound will be there.
There's a certain look that's taken over everything. A certain color palette, kind of font, and design. Today, this visual style sells us meal kits and underwear and monthly toothbrush subscriptions and just about everything else. But it's also showing up here in seemingly harmless, trendy Instagram posts about child trafficking. On Instagram, there are over 800,000 posts like this from social media influencers and regular users with the hashtag #SaveTheChildren. We've seen things like this before. Slideshows about social justice and current events dominated Instagram this summer. But something else is happening here. On Facebook, membership in pages and groups branded as anti-child trafficking grew 3,000% between July and the end of September. By the end of August, in-person rallies started taking place in cities across the world. Ending child trafficking is hardly controversial, but behind that surge in growth is the baseless conspiracy theory known as QAnon. Now, an ideology once confined to the more obscure parts of the internet is finding its way mainstream, one Instagram post at a time. On October 28, 2017, the first of a series of posts from an anonymous user appeared on the 4chan message board Paul. The user was nicknamed Q, after Q-level security clearance. That's the Energy Department equivalent of top secret. The community that followed and believed those anonymous postings became known as QAnon, and they developed an elaborate
Wait a second. Apologies. There seems to be a small crash. Let's try again. It appears that my computer is being a bit dicky. I will try again. Apologies for this. I'll get straight back to it. Essentially, the video is about, close unexpectedly. It certainly did, Microsoft Edge. That's a correct, that's a correct summary of events. Here we go. Let's try again. This is the kind of thing that can happen when you do things online. So we may just cut this bit out. Don't tell anyone. But this is kind of what's behind the mask. Am I already sharing my screen? I am not. Here we go. There we go. Cool. Everything back in business, everyone? There we go. Hooray. Now, Chris is here. There we are.
There's a certain look. Stop the community from spreading from 4chan to another messaging board 8chan and to places like Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And as it did, the posts, videos, and memes explaining its ideology became more accessible and digestible. Now, QAnon is a giant entanglement of conspiracy theories with dozens of offshoots that invites all different kinds of conspiratorial thinking into its fold.
QAnon has always been a big tent conspiracy theory that invites people of different beliefs. And the thing is, because the QAnon narrative is so broad and sprawling, people can kind of enter it and pick out the things that they like the best. That paired with the Facebook algorithm, which recommends like other groups that someone might be interested in, that turns
a very difficult combination. This doesn't seem to be working, so I'll move on. The issue here is not so much about QAnon specifically. I saw this on LinkedIn. And nextcomes.com, I had a look at that. And it's actually just a website that's about hyperlexia and literacy issues. It may even be that the creator of this image that I saw on LinkedIn genuinely feels that they weren't saying anything that harms the people that they, as specialists in hyperlexia, dyslexia, and learning difficulties, seek to support. It's not that simple, though. Look at the language. If they can't learn the way we teach the way they learn. The grammar of that is tricky. It can be read as if Lavas here is encouraging us, the teacher, to modify our approaches to fit the learning styles and needs of the child or young person. Everyone I saw comment under this post on LinkedIn certainly seemed to understand it that way. But it isn't. It's an advertisement for conversion therapy. I then contacted the person who'd unknowingly shared it, and they were happy with me discussing what happened on my blog, but have asked me to anonymize them, which I have. They have since removed the post. The wording is the thing here. What Eva Lavas is talking about is that we teach the child to learn in the way we see fit, as in, if they can't learn the way we teach, he says, describing the fashion in which learning is supposed to occur, then additionally, we as teachers teach them the way they should learn. There we go. It's exactly that wording that is so pernicious, in that it sneaks the pro-conversion therapy discourse under the noses of people invested in their children's welfare. Conversion therapy now is widely known as torture and psychological abuse. The accounts of suicide and psychiatric illness, addiction problems, and even violence caused by consistent traumatic experience have left their mark on generations of queer people. The point is always, this person is sick and we need to make them better. Their abnormality is a cancer that we need to extract and destroy so the real person can emerge. This person always happens to be straight, cis, and socially acceptable in every way. But isn't conversion therapy illegal nowadays? It is in several countries, and the UK has committed to ending the practice, but is yet to do so. In this particular one, you can see that there's a criminal prohibition in all of Canada, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Greece, in Malta, well, Corsica is part of France, in Taiwan, in Ecuador, in Guyana, and medical professionals are banned from performing conversion therapy in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, India, Vietnam, places in the Pacific, Portugal, and several states in America are a little bit more complicated because they have a ban pending or proposed. And Mexico is only banned in some subnational jurisdictions, but not all. And Australia is inconsistent, and New Zealand has a ban. But whose conversion therapy is it? In China, there have been successful cases against conversion therapy so far, and it's banned in Victoria, half the province of Canada, well, now all of them, and several US states, including New York, California, and Illinois. The European Commission came out against the practice in 2018. But this distrust of people who present in a non-normative way is present in all majoritarian societies. The history of psychiatry is littered with examples of violent abuses of power enacted upon the bodies of those who are different, including re-education camps for native and non-white populations. Those are a blight on the history and present of the world. I have no intention on showing you these examples right now. They're easily accessible if you look for them. So what is conversion therapy and where does it come from? For this, I'd like to start with a video from William Davies, Professor in Political Economy at Goldsmiths, University of London. He did a lecture recently for the London Review of Books about the reaction economy, which included a potted history of behaviorism, and I'll play that for you now.
To reactions. Identifying the mechanisms and patterns of human reaction is one of the founding ambitions of scientific psychology and what first enabled it to separate off from philosophy. Societies that pledge to respect the rights and choices of the individual have also developed an empirical fascination with how individuals are influenced by their environment. Early developments in psychological experimentation by Gustav Fechner and Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig in the late 19th century focused heavily on mental and neural responses to sensory stimuli. For instance, the time that elapsed between a sensation and a conscious reflex. The behaviorist tradition that came to dominate American psychology over the 20th century, pioneered by John B. Watson after World War I and later embodied by B.F. Skinner, was explicitly established to render human responses predictable and thereby controllable. Psychology would abandon any theory of mind in favor of data on observable behavior. A fantasy of the wholly conditioned, programmable person whose reactions are perfectly compatible with their environment loomed into view, something that provoked both utopian visions, such as Skinner's 1948 novel Walden 2, and dystopian ones, such as Anthony Burgess's 1962 A Clockwork Orange. Elements of behaviorism did become meshed with psychoanalysis in mid-20th century America via the work of the psychiatrist Adolf Meyer, whose theoretical approach dominated the US profession between World War II and the anti-psychoanalytic revolutions of the 1970s. Meyer's medicalized co-option of Freud involved observing patients in controlled environments so that the health of their day-to-day behavior could be assessed. As Meyer had written in 1908, quote, "Our comparative measure of the various disabilities is the normal, complete reaction. A good psychiatrist was one who could distinguish efficient from inefficient reactions, which could only go on in the controlled environment of the asylum or hospital." The behaviorist tradition has revealed a lot about how humans and other animals respond to different stimuli and what might count as a normal or healthy
person or healthy mind. You can see the issues there. Who decides that? Who is in charge of that? And so I wrote a letter to the editor of the LRB in order to add to Professor Davies's lecture, if I'm allowed. There we go. This is the letter to the editor slide because this is what I've become. I'll read the first bit. I would like to add to Professor Davies's excellent article, as well as his wonderful talk you posted on your YouTube channel. I do not seek to challenge his points about the reaction economy. His analysis is sound. He talks about how emojis and reactions and likes are what and clicks are what fueling an online economy now of emotional reactions to things, and that content, those things, has to be endlessly produced and reacted to. His analysis is sound on that. However, I would like to add the point of neurodiversity. Professor Davies excellently highlights the history of behaviorism, but since it's not the focus of this talk, he's agnostic on its validity in the first place. Behaviorism, like Freudianism, is a turn of the 20th century psychiatric movement that seeks to make the philosophical characteristics of early psychology from the 18th and 19th century scientific, generalizable, and universally applicable. However, behaviorism as a method of practicing psychology is itself at fault. The famous 6 sessions of CBT after a 2-year waiting list has been the choice of an NHS ideologically throttled. Only testability and efficacy matter. As we all know, with enough force, you can make anyone do anything. Does mental health actually improve after these therapies? Who can say? The numbers don't lie, except, of course, when they do. Currently, the UK government is yet again reworking the conversion therapy ban it has been playing around with for half a decade now. It highlights the dangers to lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, and should also include asexuals and aspec people, non-binary, trans, queer, gender non-conforming, and intersex minorities. Still, until we question the conversion therapy systems that are a norm in British education, healthcare, and social care systems, we cannot keep safe the vulnerable minorities the bill is supposed to protect. Modern conversion therapy's designer, Ola Ivalovas, was nothing if not a Skinnerite. He believed unwanted behavior could and should be modified towards the norm. Who decides that norm? Well, he did, obviously, in the same way he decided that homosexuals needed to be cured. In his later years, he became one of the designers of applied behavioral analysis. ABA, as it's known, is the brand name for conversion therapy, which is currently the only form of support parents of autistic children on Medicaid can receive in the US. ABA therapy can take up to 40 hours a week and punishes, humiliates, shames, and even allows the physical assault of children acting autistically. Who decides? Lovas does. When he was alive, he did. Nowadays, it's the provider. When autistic people stim, flap our hands, echo, or seek to self-regulate in painful or pressurizing situations, we are punished instead. This forced internalization is obviously distressing and lies at the basis of much suffering in the autistic community. The suicide numbers, I'll come back to those by the way, are evident. In practice, ABA is a multi-level marketing scheme with a self-sufficient, endlessly growing revenue stream. The suffering of disabled people. The response to autistic people's trauma? ABA. When someone is traumatized by ABA, do more ABA. When the autistic person dies decades before their neurotypical peers, the provider may believe they did everything they could to help. They did quite the reverse, but this realization will be too painful to fully comprehend. Just getting into the letter, out of the letter for a second, here's some of Ola Ivalovas on the interlinking between conversion therapy and his work in ABA. In 1974, George Rakers and Ola Ivalovas published the article Behavioral Treatment of Deviant Sex Role Behaviors in a Male Child. I just saw my own life there. The article cited Green and Money as a source of the growing evidence that childhood cross-gender manifestations are indicative of later adult sexual abnormalities, e.g. transvesticism, transsexualism, or some form of homosexuality. It noted that many transgender women and gay men reported their, quote, cross-gender behaviors began in early childhood, end quote, and the research showed it was difficult or impossible to shift in adults. The authors felt the best way to prevent, quote, future sexual deviance, end quote, or at least make it as unlikely as possible, was to correct gender nonconforming behavior at a young age. The method the paper detailed was a token-based reinforcement system administered by the parents, which rewarded gender conformity and punished deviancy. Blue chips were a sign of good behavior and could be swapped for chocolate bars. Red chips were a sign of bad behavior and resulted in isolation and beatings. The child with cross-gender identification, who was featured in the paper and appeared in many later works published by Rakers as a proof of successful treatment, committed suicide at 38. Despite the bleakness of that, I find it hilarious that Lavas cited Green and Money as his sources, but that's beside the point for now. This is called the Feminine Boy Project and was undertaken in the 1970s after the American Association of Psychiatry's annual meeting was stormed by people who didn't believe that homosexuality was a disease. Newsflash, it isn't. And then they used the same system to deny the humanity of autistic people. Eva Lavas also made a huge amount of money off of selling ABA using the same systems that he developed when working with children who were gender non-conforming. Back to the talk, to the letter. ABA is expensive, it is torture, it is eugenics. Why are autistic people uniquely vulnerable? Well, the double empathy problem. In 2012, Dr. Damien Milton, who I played ping pong with at Aldscape in 2019, and absolutely slaughtered me. The man is a machine. In 2012, Dr. Damien Milton described this empathy gap between autistics and non-autistics, also known as neurotypicals, as two different but completely equal empathetic systems, unable to understand one another intuitively. Instead, they would need to adapt to one another's needs and cognitively work to meet the other mind halfway. Yet, quite the opposite is occurring at the moment. Only one form of empathy, that of neurotypicals, is validated. Autistic people, for our part, are represented on the whole as having no internality at all. The diagnosis reflects that. Even the word itself comes from autos, self, and comes out of an insult that 19th century posh ladies would throw at another for wanting to have another biscuit. The meaning was obviously, you're selfish, Imogen, how dare you? Behaviorist psychology is, despite its protestations, just as historically contingent as the Freudians it rightly mocked at the time. Also, this is an example of a study that was done, I'm just out of the letter for a moment again, on thin slice judgment, which is Sasson et al. Doing research in 2017. And what they did essentially was they had a test group of 80 neurotypicals and of about 60 autistic people in the control group. And then they got something that's like, it's like a Sega rally machine, and they made it soundproof and light-proof, and people would go inside. And then the people would have to rate something out of 10. This is done a lot in marketing. So if a piece of advertising doesn't land in the first second, it only deserves to go in the bin, because if it doesn't grab you in the first second, it is useless and you have to throw it away. However, this time what people looked at were human beings interacting in different forms, either visual information, moving or still, auditory information, or a combination of those two. And they didn't tell the test and the control group that they were talking about autism, and they gave no one any diagnostic statements of any people they looked at. Now, look what happened. I'll start with the control group. So autistic people looking at other autistic people. The results were actually quite high. Out of 10, it was like 9, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, 8, 7, 9, 8, 7. That's quite high. Autistic people towards neurotypical was a bit lower. So 7, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 5, 6, 7, 8. Neurotypicals towards neurotypicals is kind of in between that. So 8, 7, 9, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 7, 9, 8. Neurotypicals towards autistic people was 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 0, 3, 2, 0, 1. It was very low. Somehow, neurotypicals were able to assess, without seeing us for more than a second, without a diagnostic label, that we as people were less interesting to talk to, were less approachable, were less accessible, were less interesting to have a conversation with. This has huge ramifications because it shows that a huge problem with autism and the way that autistic people cannot access similar things in the real world has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with neurotypicals. It is not about the group that is discriminated against. It's about the group that's doing the discriminating. ABA is expensive. It is torture. It is eugenics. Autism is synonymous with robotic, cold exteriors and empty interiors. My partner, who's at the back making happy noises, reading a book, had to pretend that he was an unempathetic husk just to get an autism diagnosis when he was 15 after a 7-year waiting list. Autism as a concept is nothing but a shibboleth, a ghost, an obsession of neurotypicals with the human that looks like a human, but isn't really. Cultural examples of this include the changeling, the robot, Frankenstein's monster, the homosexual, particularly during the so-called Hays Code in American cinema, people of color on the whole, and the sociopath. Does that mean that autism as we know it doesn't exist? No, it is just that those who are autistic face certain obstacles baked into the very language with which we are designated. So, why do we ban it? Why don't we ban conversion therapy? Banning these abusive practices and ending the continued financial exploitation of queer people and their families is paramount and should be done immediately. However, even with a ban on conversion therapy, not all LGBTQIA+ people will be protected from conversion therapy. In most countries have limits as to what can be prevented and where the ban's legal power ends. It may only apply to minors, like in Germany. It may be consented to. It may be allowed within the context of religious communities or only banned in government-funded healthcare. It may be freely sold on the open market, or it may be advertised with stealth. If you want to get conversion therapy for your queer child, all you need to do is Google ABA practitioner near me. There, you got it. ABA is conversion therapy. Like QAnon posts changing to save the children, they've renamed, reframed, and rebranded, and they're selling it with great success, in particular to parents and educators of autistic and neurodivergent people. They are the very same practices that are used to straighten out queers, developed by the same man, still sold, and very, very popular. What I'm going to show you is a video of Chloe Everett, a neurodivergent student speaking at TED in 2019.
In the 1960s, a man named Ole Ivar Lovaas saw great promise in B.F. Skinner's work on pigeons and rats to be adopted to humans. B.F. Skinner did studies where he would give the animals rewards if you pressed a bar. This is a concept known as operant conditioning. The subject is given a reward if they perform the correct choice, or given a punishment if they choose the incorrect choice. Lovaas created this into a treatment known as applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, and he hoped it would be able to make children, quote, indistinguishable from their peers. The first child to be referred to Lovaas's clinic was a young girl named Beth, who had very severe self-injurious behaviors. When Beth would become agitated, she would bang her head on hard surfaces, such as tables or filing cabinets. Lovaas attempted to teach her behaviors such as hugging when it was requested or responding to music with dancing. Initially, Lovaas and his team ignored Beth's self-injurious behaviors as they thought acknowledging it would cause it to be reinforced. When that didn't work, they tried consoling her, using phrases such as, "I do not think you are bad." That didn't work either. And one day, Lovaas got so frustrated with Beth that he, in his own words, quote, cracked her one on the rear. Beth ceased all her headbanging behaviors after that. The next set of children to be referred to Lovaas's clinic was a pair of twins, 2 boys named Mike and Marty. Mike and Marty had, quote, a fair amount of tantrum behaviors, such as screaming, throwing objects, and hitting themselves. Lovaas tried loud sounds over 100 decibels, but when that didn't work, he implemented and activated an electric floor when the twins took more than 3 seconds to initiate a hug with a lab assistant. They also weren't allowed any food or drink except for the token scraps that they earned for performing desirable behaviors. After some time, Mike and Marty quickly and outwardly displayed affection. There was very much media coverage for Lovaas's work with the twins. People praised him for his effectiveness with his work. However, it was not without criticism. Even B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning and the muse of ABA, spoke out against this treatment. Parents weren't exactly sold on the idea of harming their children into being normal either. Lovaas responded to this criticism by accusing the parents of not loving their children and presenting his therapy as the only way that their children could lead normal lives. Despite methods like Teach, which originated around the same time and were much friendlier, Teach did not get quite the same amount of press as ABA and therefore was not nearly as common. You may have also noticed the recent outcry against gay conversion therapy. Gay kids are being abused into no longer experiencing sexual attraction, and they are protesting their treatment. People are calling for gay conversion therapy to be banned, especially for minors. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with autism and ABA? And the answer to that is actually quite a bit. Not only was ABA and gay conversion therapy created by exactly the same person, it uses virtually the same techniques. We all know it's not okay to force a child to be someone they're not and have the love and support of others around them be based on their ability to be someone they're not. So I ask you this. Why is it okay when the child is autistic, but for any other child, it's considered inhumane? When are we going to start holding the same standards for children in ABA? To this day, we still use the same techniques on autistic children as we would with rats and rats with wings. Shock devices, although they are not nearly as common, are still used in some places, such as the Judge Rottenberg Center, despite the FDA condemning their use. Scientists have also noticed an epidemic of emotional health problems within the autistic community. A 2015 study in Sweden identified that adults with autism are 10 times more likely to commit suicide compared to the general population. An additional study in 2018 identified masking as a major risk factor for suicidal ideation in autistic adults. Masking is, again, hiding neurodivergent traits in the interest of appearing more normal. And unfortunately, masking is something that ABA very much encourages.
Yes. As Everett says, Lovaas was a man who created a behaviorist approach to converting children based on B.F. Skinner's work on operant conditioning in rats and pigeons. If you reward good behavior and punish bad behavior, he hoped it would make autistic children, quote, indistinguishable from their peers, end quote. As she says, Eva Lovaas used child abuse in order to stop children stimming. Teach, which she shows as a kind of kinder way of it is a system of behavior modification using mostly common sense systems that aid autistic people in communicating to neurotypicals. SEN schools I work with buy these systems for thousands of pounds a year, when all these resources can be created simply by the children themselves with the help of someone who validates their sense of self. Autism Speaks, a for-profit company masking as a charity, sells ABA and other behaviorist interventions across the world. In the US, ABA is widely popular and often the only method present for, whoa, what are you doing? There we go. Often the only method present in discussions about the well-being of autistic people. Funding for special education support is often snapped up by Autism Speaks, and the organisation seeks to support. The vast majority of research into autism is either seeking for a cure or doing genetic research on the so-called causes of autism, usually something to do with guts and bowels. Regarding this guy. Back to the letter. In the UK, PBS, or positive behaviour support, is used more than ABA. Despite the more gentle branding, PBS is just as demeaning, guilt-inducing, and psychologically scarring. It's very English in that way. It takes no interest in the origins of what it refers to as, quote, problematic behaviour, end quote, and seeks to change the patient rather than the environment. Why hasn't it been banned? Because behaviourism is baked into the fundamental modes of doing mental health provision. But it's also everywhere in education. In his talk, Professor Davies mentioned behaviour management. This is a mandatory course for PGCE students in the UK. For those who don't know, PGCE means it's a postgraduate teacher training course that you can do at a university after doing your regular degree. So behaviour modification is mandatory. SEND, special educational needs and dyslexia, is not. Guess who ends up stuck in behaviour management? Disabled students, obviously. Why do scandals like the Winterbourne scandal keep happening? Because torture is the norm in the NHS. Forcing people to change who they are is a messy business, so those who can't stand the heat get out of the kitchen. Those who can love the sadism imbued into the very nature of their practice. When I train organisations on neurodiversity, I usually say that the more difficult to train staff members are those who have had some autism training, because they have to unlearn the abusive methods they have been exposed to, like restraint. In practice, ABA is horrifying. When I was at a training for SEN teaching assistant in 2021, we were shown videos of autistic students being abused by staff who, in good faith, were believing that they were being kind and loving whilst the children under their care were suffering. This was awful and I needed to recover afterwards. I have 2 slides about this, including a video, but I will not show that today. If you want to see them, contact me and I'll link it up to you. Still, I was happy I was there. The neurotypical trainees could not empathise with the autistic children in distress that we were looking at. I was able to say that these children would be going on to self-harm, possibly that day. That was hugely appreciated because they had no idea. We're back here with a double empathy problem. The lack of intuitive empathy from neurotypicals towards autistics is to blame here. Our humanity is routinely denied by those who seek to talk about us. A few years ago, the chief executive of Autism Speaks wrote a blog post in which she equated having a, quote, having a child with autism to not living, end quote. The step from not living as a parent with an autistic child to the autistic child being as good as dead is a small one. Scarily, it bears repeating that being autistic is, on the whole, pretty good. As Chloe said, not only were ABA and gay conversion therapy created by the same person, it uses virtually the same techniques. Modern gay conversion therapy, I have to add here, because gay conversion therapy of some form had been around since the diagnosis of homosexuality came into being by Krafft-Ebing in Germany in the mid-19th century. You only diagnose something as a disorder when you seek it as a problem to be gotten rid of. And so in the early 20th century, the same was done with autism. If you behave in a way that's inappropriate, you need to be changed. Whether that's to do with your gender, sexuality, or the way you present racially, ethnically, and your neurotype. She also says, why is it okay when a child is autistic, but for any other child it's considered inhumane? When are we going to hold the same standards for children in ABA, end quote. To this day, the Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts in the US is using electroshock devices to deliver shock to autistic people for behaving, quote, autistically. The vast majority of the young people there are Black and people of color. Suicide rates, again, I've talked about that already. I'll give you a British example. In Britain in 2016, 1% of all deaths was due to suicide. Of that 1%, 11% was diagnosed autistic. This misses all the people who were not diagnosed before. We call that a choice. Here's when things come together. The modern anti-vax movement started in 1998 with Andrew Wakefield being awful. H Bomber Guy, who is on YouTube as H Bomber Guy, but his name is Harry Brewers, is a wonderful essayist and has made a feature-length documentary on how the anti-vaccine movement, as we know it now, got started in the late 90s. Watch it in your own time because we haven't got time for it today. Instead, I'll show you a quick clip from Al Jazeera from 2011, so 12 years ago.
Disgraced and discredited, the doctor who convinced thousands of parents to skip vital vaccinations for their children. Andrew Wakefield's already been stripped of his medical licence. Now he's been called a fraud. 13 years ago, he published research in The Lancet magazine, which claimed the 3-in-1 measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, MMR, was linked to autism. Now, after a long investigation, the influential British medical journal says the report has been discredited.
I think what we now know is that the Lancet paper, which was always felt to be bad science, is a deliberate fraud that was perpetrated in order to try to show a link between the vaccine and autism.
The investigation found Wakefield altered facts about patients in his study. Despite having supporters, the UK medical professions watchdog, the General Medical Council, stripped him of his medical licence last year, calling him dishonest and irresponsible. Yet speaking to an American TV show, Wakefield claimed there had been a
ruthless, pragmatic attempt to crush any attempts to investigate valid vaccine safety concerns.
After the initial research was published, the number of children vaccinated against measles, mumps and rubella dropped across the world, putting lives at risk.
There's no doubt the vaccination rates tumbled, and dangerously so, that there were outbreaks and that a few children, I think 2 children, did die as a result.
Wakefield now lives and works in the US, where he has a number of high-profile supporters. No study has shown any clear link between vaccines and autism. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, London.
Yeah, the power of Wakefield's lie has been huge. It's been an inroad to the far right for many people, primarily in America. White women especially were radicalized due to an understandable awkwardness many may feel towards corporate medicine. The increase in autistic diagnoses since the 1970s, which is expertly described in Steve Silverman's Neurotribes, also brought a movement to explain away our difference due to biological causation. Wakefield, as a former gastroenterologist, created a fake disease that somehow explained the eating issues many autistics have and linked it to an unappetizing part of our anatomy. What H. Bomber Guy also doesn't say in his documentary was the reason this particular lie caught on so much. It's not just about the fact that Wakefield wanted to sell a new measles vaccine, and in order to do that had to discredit the MMR one. It's that it's about us. Our lives are not worthy of living. I find it hard to read materials that describe my community in the 90s or 2000s because the language is so patronizing. We're not human. Therefore, if you want to delegitimize vaccines for your personal gain, the group to use is us. It will not surprise you that Autism Speaks still encourages and funds research into so-called autistic enterocolitis, as well as selling conversion therapy, because of course they do. A while back on my YouTube subscriptions, an old documentary about Stephen Wiltshire appeared. Well, not that old, Stephen, if you'll hear it. And I had to turn it off because of the language used that they used to describe Stephen. It's this particular mix of pity, fascination, and disgust that accompanied discussions of homosexuality during my lifetime, and that fuels discussions of trans issues now. Autistics are somehow not people. Autistic children, therefore, are disposable. Rhetorically, you also often find it that we fall into the trap when describing the child abuse committed by Wakefield. He paid kids a $5 to give blood for his ridiculous study, and he got children with gastrointestinal issues and autistic children to undergo severe amounts of gastrointestinal unnecessary surgery and anal cleaning and rectal cleaning. It's not safe for children. to get the kind of medication that they were given in order to get the kind of results that Wakefield was looking for. He put them at risk. So Brewis in his video says, some of these children weren't even autistic, end quote. This makes sense within the context of Wakefield purportedly doing research on a disease only developed by autistic people. But the underlying idea is that if you're autistic, your life is not as valuable as your neurotypical peers. I can't imagine Brewis agreeing with that statement at all. As I discussed in my autistic coding blogs from a couple of years ago, being autistic has such a negative cultural reputation that our inhumanity is baked into the language. As an aside, by the way, has anyone, I don't know if anyone, maybe Steve Silberman said this before, because it's so logical. As the pathologization of queer people was brought to an end in the 1970s, the pathologization of autistics became all the more evident and culturally repressive. Similarly to Foucault's arguments in The History of Madness, mental illness was not a serious problem in medieval France until after leprosy was mostly eradicated. Intuitively, Ivo Lovaas and his theories pivoted away from gay conversion, which has been far more of a niche concern in recent years. The money was elsewhere. Now, unfortunately, the money is coming right back into it. Our dehumanization has forced the anti-vaccine movement of modern times. We are seen as something to be eradicated from the earth. Anti-vaccine conspiracy theories have led plenty to be radicalized to the far right. The modern eugenics movement is based in the hatred of us and people like us. The gays in cis, lesbian, and cis-gay acceptance have not caused a shift in power. The changes to racist patriarchy have not undone the central power system that we live under. Fascist Germany's TFIA programs were not that long ago. It was only 80 years ago. The same language was used about us then as it is now. We remain at risk. I also heard Luke Bearden speak for Alt Angel a couple of years ago. He spoke about how dehumanizing the entire research literature on autistics was when he started specializing as a researcher. The behaviorist paradigm sets us up as less than human. We need to keep on challenging it, which won't happen without autistics at the heart of any movement. Stop that, please. There we go. All this is, by the way, I'm not going to do this. This is a video, don't watch it, it's bad. Only if you want to harm yourself a bit. No, don't do that. There we go. Right, let's do a personal example. I've had behavioral interventions, in addition to, of course, life itself, being a behavioral intervention all of its own. When I was 13, I was terrified about money. My father had died by suicide less than a year before, and even though my mother was better able to pay for things now that he was gone, I was still terrified about money. Like, my father was diagnosed with bipolar 1 and in mania spent all the money that he made. So my mother had to scrimp and save and borrow money from friends and family. At his funeral, I'd been told by his side of the family that I was now the man of the house and needed to take care of my mother and younger brother. I think that's how this particular anxiety developed. My mother spoke about it to a now former friend of hers who was a trained psychiatric nurse. She came round and, shouting at me, forced my face down onto the floor, crying, vomiting, and begging for mummy to forgive me, because I was not the parent, I was the child, and she was the parent. I stopped expressing worries about money. Instead, I started binge eating more. And just after my father's death also, that was in a therapeutic community in Flanders called Oorsof. Don't look it up, it's not there anymore. Apparently, I wasn't expressing my grief in the right way. So I was asked to sit on a mat in the middle of a meditation room. Then a grown man started poking me in the side as hard as he could for what seemed like hours, but could only have been a few minutes. I then had to express my rage by bashing him over the head with a cushion. I was praised, but really, I was terrified of my own anger now. That didn't help. I was also given a rescue remedy when I had meltdowns. I don't know if you remember those. It's like basically ethanol, like 70% pure alcohol. And it would be put under my tongue, which is amazing for repressing autistic meltdowns. It also meant I internalized absolutely everything, leading to greater internalized anxiety and depression and more binge eating, which is great. I've got so many examples of this. And I haven't even started talking about the ways that medical professionals and education professionals deal with us. I am now, after many travails, an actually autistic mentor of autistic students, some of whom are actually here. Hello. One of them, and I asked permission to share this, received early intervention as a 5-year-old child. This young person is the only autistic mentee who I work with who is straight and cisgender. All others are LGBTQIA+ in some way. That's not an accident. As Levin showed in his work, he was committed to reducing unacceptable behaviors, be that in sexuality, gender, or neurotype. As said before, autistic people are overwhelmingly queer. The idea that you could be autistic and queer is still, for many people, a new thing, even for clinicians. So in 2021, I became a DSA-funded mentor, and I needed to do this course. This online course was reviewed and found successful in 2020 by the DSA. Again, trigger warnings all over the place. I've removed all references to the company in question due to fear of abuse of libel laws. Fair use still applies. I would quite like to say that being a mentor is like the most vulnerable a student is going to be with you about their disability. You have such an amount of power over the well-being of a student and such a responsibility for their safeguarding. This is the first line of defense. So let's see what I had to do in order to become a mentor. So this is a general disability awareness training. Did you know a lack of vitamin D during pregnancy has been linked to autism? Oh no. A person with Asperger's syndrome may show higher than average abilities and logical thoughts. Asperger's syndrome is not a good thing to talk about. So I contacted the company and was like, yeah, do you want me to have a look at this? Because like disability education is kind of my job. And then I did the course and I just sent an email with tons of these slides. I've picked out a couple of the more choice ones, including the test at the end. This is going to be a laugh. Look at that list. And what the hell is he doing there? He was never diagnosed autistic. He is just a Nobel Prize winner sticking out his tongue. Okay. Autistic spectrum is apparently linear. There is atypical autism. What the hell is that? Asperger's syndrome has not been a diagnosis since 2013. High-functioning autism never existed. Classic autism never existed. This may be seen as an oversimplification. Yeah, I'd say it's an oversimplification. The difference between HFA and AS is that a child meets the milestones for speech at the usual age in the latter, but doesn't achieve them in the former. No. Autism, the autism spectrum isn't from a little bit autistic to massively autistic. It is actually a 3D integrative space with multiple variables that can change during the day and that have lots and lots of different comorbidities and sensory sensitivities and sensory hyposensitivities as well. And it is not stable. What it isn't is a functioning label, high and low functioning. That does not exist. I can look classically autistic if you punish me hard enough. I can look classically autistic to people on days where I can't speak because I'm so tired and overloaded. This is the kind of stuff. This was slide number 6. Let's keep going. Philosophy. It's about looking at things. This is the kind of stuff that they were doing. I think after my complaint, this is the only thing they changed. What the hell do you see an Indian or an Eskimo? What the actual hell? So this is also, interestingly, a way that providers of ABA and PBS push a level of kind of, well, pastel QAnon onto the practices that they use. No, it's about understanding differences, yet very strongly imposing them still. Treatments for autism. What the balls is this? Early intervention. Hooray! It's actually advertising early intervention. God love it. Early years intervention. Treatments likely to work out. Early teaching by parents. Hooray! Applied behavioral analysis. Hooray! Teach. We talked about this. Treatment education of autistic and related communication handicapped children. Need to be trained how to do it and have to pay an awful lot of money in order to do so. Medication. What the hell? Methylphenidate is drug as a stimulant. Some people might be quite useful for that. Other people, no. The thing to not do is to medicate autistic symptoms, whatever the hell those are, with Ritalin. If someone wants and needs forms of support for ADHD type behaviors and type brain, that's fine. That is absolutely fine. But don't push it on people and don't put it on slide number, I don't know how many, in an autism awareness course. Treatments that work but whose harms may outweigh benefits. Risperdal. It may calm a person if they have behavioral issues, fight or try to hurt themselves. There's a side effect, though, that include appetite increased, salivation increased, fatigue, upper respiratory tract infections. This was in 2021. Do you remember what COVID actually was? It was an upper respiratory tract infections. Next one. This was weird, wasn't it? Secretin. This is a hormone. In the past, some researchers have said that secretin helped symptoms of autism. No, they did not. It was a conspiracy theory from the mid-90s that was allied to the gut MMR nonsense theory. Next, mental health issues. Catatonia. No. Catatonia is not what autistic people have when we shut down. We stop being able to move, to be able to speak, to be able to look at people. We can be rigid. I've had those. Sometimes they're quite nice. It is the body saying, and now you're going to rest. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit angry about this, because this is, again, the first line of defense for autistic people to call when they are having a bad time. Asperger's. In 1944, the Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger observed 4 boys who had difficulty with social interaction. Although intelligence appeared to be at least average, the children had difficulties with blah, 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 blah. He called the children little professors because they could speak extensively about topics which interested them. Over the years, there's been a growing awareness of the need to recognize specific needs which people on this part of the autistic spectrum have and to provide services appropriate for them. Or Asperger's syndrome was invented because of money. In the 1970s, Lorna Wing and Judith Gould in the UK wanted to do research on autistic young people and adults. In order to get money for that research, they needed to invent a new diagnosis. Otherwise, it was not going to happen. Asperger was long dead. He died in the early 70s. He was gone. So that's one. It was never a real thing. It only existed in order to do research on it. They made it up because they didn't have a choice. Judith Gould has Lorna Wing is dead. She died a couple of years ago, but Judith Gould has actually come out in the most recent NAS training, National Autistic Society training, saying that they were wrong about Asperger's syndrome and that they were wrong about the triad of impairments, about that autistic people have impairments in communication, socialization, and imagination. It's all wrong. And she's saying that now herself. Also, Hans Asperger was at the time in 1944, not Austrian. He was part of Nazi Germany. He was also a fervent fascist and eugenicist and sent many of his little professors to the gas chambers, which needs to be said. Again, definition of Asperger's and high-functioning autism is nonsense. This is not great. These puzzle pieces are a trademark of Autism Speaks. And it's there for a very particular reason, to show that we are not quite human, that there's a puzzle piece or two missing, that they have to be put in. CBT is a behaviorist method. PBS, behaviorist method. If they become anxious or challenged and are able to understand the impact of their reactions on others, understand things from another point of view, the reason for that is too much stress already. Our behavior in high states of stress is a response to your behavior that is exclusionary, intentionally or not intentionally. Autism Act 2009, which failed. I was there in 2019 at the meeting of the parliamentary inquiry on the autism strategy. It did not go well. And so they had to rethink and plan the autism strategy, and they managed to do so in mid-2021. Hasn't happened yet. Still waiting for things to actually roll through. There's still tons of trainings that just have not been done. There's no money that's invested in it specifically, because over the last 13 years, we have had an omnishambles, constant crisis series of governments. And no, it's not looking like things are on the way up when it comes to that, certainly not under a Conservative government. So no. Here's the test. What is the triad of impairments? Social interaction, coach, communication, imagination. Oh, great. I have to do this test and I have to get 100% in order to pass and do this job. Hooray, let's lie about myself and my community. What's 3 unknown side effect methylphenidate? Oh, that sounds fun. 6, what's a way of coping with anxiety levels of someone with Asperger's? Don't call it retreating into their particular interest. It keeps us alive and it stops us being harmed by you. 8, CBT is false. Well, I had to do it again because I messed up. Was first identified by Leo Kanner in 1943. According to this is false, but it's true, but actually it's false. It was first identified by Grunya Sakharova in 1921 in the Soviet Union, but that didn't really make it out of the Soviet Union because the Soviets were busy with the Civil War and she was a she, and so her ideas weren't shared as widely as they should have been. Leo Kanner was actually Asperger's former colleague at the University of Vienna and had to run away for fasci reasons. Which of these famous people did not have autistic tendencies? Diana Ross, Albert Einstein, Sir Isaac Newton. First of all, 2 of those people are super dead. And the third, Diana Ross might not want to tell you. Maybe she is autistic. I don't know. But how is that in any way supportive? And also, why don't we include actually autistic people? Greta Thunberg, Daryl Hannah is a famous autistic actress. Chris Packham is very famous and also very autistic. What the hell? Which of the below is not a form of autism? Epilepsy. That's correct. That is correct. Epilepsy is not a form of autism. It's a brain disease. Rett syndrome I'd never heard of. Rett syndrome is not a form of autism. It is a wasting disease of the connective tissues, and it only appears in girls because boys tend to die before before being born. It's a genetic disorder, and children don't live much over the age of 7. So no, that has nothing to do with autism. It's horrible, but it's not to do with autism. This was the weirdest one. Which of these below statements would be unlikely to be said by someone with autism, considering the way they comprehend you, me, and I? I would like a cup of tea, please. Joe would like a cup of tea. Would Jim like to watch TV with David? Honestly, I've been looking at this question for 2 years and I still don't know the correct answer for that. Again, first line of defense, funded by the DSA, who said, oh no, this is great, in 2020. So I complained. And I tried to raise a complaint with Student Finance England, and I couldn't, because I couldn't raise a complaint with Student Finance England because they and the DSA were the exact same. And I asked, okay, so who do I speak to? And there were 2 options that were given. One is the Department for Education, which is led by Tories, so maybe not. And the other is the Institute for Human Rights and Equalities. Can't remember that's the name, but yeah, name kind of escaped me. Yeah, Equality, Diversity, Human Rights group. They have recently been ruling in favor of conversion therapy for trans people. So that's fun, isn't it? Being gender critical is being neurochauvinist. So these things are actually happening this week. There was an article in The Guardian about 2 of the SNP leadership candidates calling J.K. Rowling a known transphobe national treasure. Spectrum 10K is a study that's going on at the moment, and it wants to look at the genetic causes of autism, because apparently we haven't had that for the past 40 years, where up to 80% of funding has been looking at exactly that. Most of the rest has been looking into better ways to, give us conversion therapy. And only recently have actually autistic researchers been allowed to do basic things. We're also struggling as people with a representation problem. The way the concept of autism falls into popular culture is as regular dehumanization of autistic and neurodivergent people. We are portrayed as monsters. We are to be pitied and feared, and the presence and or absence of sexual urges are fundamental to that. I've written and spoken before about autistic coding in fiction and the damage these portrayals do and have done to the autistic community even eons before the coining of the term autism. However, things get worse. In 2021, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom ruled against an autistic man with learning disabilities when he wanted to know if he had the right to sex. They ruled that he does not because of his learning disability, but because he is autistic. According to the expert witness, who's a behaviorist, autistic people lack the capacity to understand consent. This rendered autistic people then rapists the moment we engage in sexual contact at all. This is absurd on its face, as anyone who's into the kink scene will know. Kink is fundamentally about explicit, enthusiastic, verbalized consent, which is apparently we are incapable of understanding as it relates to others. The kink scene is full of autistics, including myself, for that very reason. This decision is a frightening form of dehumanization. In keeping with the rhetoric underlying British transphobia in politics and the media, it will have passed most people by that the 2022 debate on the conversion therapy bill was interrupted multiple times by MPs challenging autistic people's trans experience for reasons of us being easily led and confused about ourselves. You saw Marjorie Taylor Greene there in the US saying that the victims are autistic. We are majority queer and far more likely to identify as gender non-conforming. This is a direct attack, whether conscious or not, on the neurodivergent and queer community. the double rainbow. Now, I don't subscribe to an anti-psychiatry belief. There still will need to be a need for mental health care under full socialism. But that should not preclude a very thorough look at who is included and who is dehumanized in the 21st century due to their neurotype, which is an intersectional identity that sees different mistreatment depending on the autistic person's gender, disability, sexuality, race, and class. See, for example, the cases of Elijah McClain or Racine Brown. The history of psychiatry is, as Tom Burns wrote in 2014, quote, our necessary shadow, end quote. But we should continue to pay attention to what's happening under our very noses. The behaviorist turn has had its sight firmly on us since we and behaviorism came into existence in the early 20th century. We are the ultimate behaviorist fantasy as autistic people, a body that can be made into a person by force and conditioning. In order to challenge that violence, there needs to be a deracination of behaviorist practices within all forms of society. However, trauma-informed approaches are less immediately measurable. It would also mean that lived experience advocates should be allowed to lead in the fields of our experience. Lastly, it becomes impossible to render us the human waste that funds needless institutionalization, which the 2019 parliamentary inquiry had only seen increase in the previous 10 years. Too many people are currently making a great living out of our deaths. Challenging that will require a violent paradigm shift away from the very systems that are meant to support us and towards lived experience advocacy. Call me a black and white thinker all you want, but behaviorism and autistic people cannot coexist. Behaviorism for autistic people is necro-capitalism running on our blood. Forgiveness will need to include structural societal change and an epistemic shift towards what makes us a human being. ABA is conversion therapy, and conversion therapy is ABA. Team Teach, PBS are only manifestations of the very same behaviorist approach. If you want to stop someone in a meltdown from hurting themselves, perhaps try to not put them in a meltdown in the first place. If you want to see your child to be more normal, try and see things from their perspective instead of imposing yours on them. If we as a country want to move on from eugenics, we need to see all queer people protected from conversion therapy, not just the privileged neurotypes. ABA, though, is damaging, even for straight and cis autistics. Why do they deserve to be treated under the same self-hate inducing poison that under this legislation that was proposed by Theresa May at the time, and then even stripped further by Boris Johnson, queers would be free of? I'm not usually one to toot my horn for the straights, but some of my favorite mothers are. My mother shouldn't have had to be re-educated if she had been autistic. This is the one exception to the rule where what about the straights is not a dickish question to ask. If ABA is illegal for LGBTQIA+ people, then it should be illegal across the board, however entrenched the systems of power currently are. We do know the problems. We do know what's going on with the conversion therapy ban as initially planned by Theresa May in 2017 and 2018, and then also never handled. They just never did it. And then Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in 2019. And initially he wanted just to kill the conversion therapy ban. And instead, they did something even more pernicious. They actually kept it, but only for cisgender lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. They went in full on transphobia, and also acephobia, and also non-binary phobia, and also intersex phobia. However, as autistic people, we wouldn't have had a chance. A friend of mine is trans and autistic, and was not believed that she was her own gender for 15 years because she was autistic. The clinician in the NHS told her that she couldn't be trans because she had autism. I got this message from Robbie DeSantos, Director of Communications and External Affairs at Stonewall back in 2021. Conversion therapy in all its forms is harmful to individuals and communities. At Stonewall, we want to live in a world where every lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer person is free to be themselves. That's why, as a part of the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition, we will keep campaigning the government to bring in a full legal ban on LGBTQIA+ conversion therapy in the UK. A full legal ban on conversion therapy needs to include everyone, including those who are neurodiverse, which is how we refer to it, and LGBTQIA+, and be effective across all settings, including faith, medical, and therapy settings. Our communities have been waiting almost 3 years for the UK government to follow through on their promise to ban all conversion therapy. The UK government must publish a comprehensive bill now, as well as a clear time for its implementation. We are still waiting. Potentially Rishi Sunak's bill will include more people, but we're fighting for scraps here. I'd been trying to push very hard in order for this to be included. However, the Boris Johnson government looked at the conversion therapy ban, spoke to the churches and was like, let's go with the churches instead. So there is a protest which I am planning to go to on the 10th of April at 1 p.m. I will try to make it, although the recent police and crime bill criminalized protesters that are noisy and annoying. And as you've been able to see, I am both of those things. As I'm autistic, I'm both. I expect to be arrested, but I'd rather be arrested for doing the right thing than stand idly by. So, concluding remarks. We have a lot of fighting to do. We need to end conversion therapy for all, not just a privileged group of neurotypical queer people. If desperate patients, like the patient who reached out for ABA practitioners near me a few years ago, feel the need to convert their children to neurotypical, then that's first of all an indictment of a society that wants them to in the first place. We need to keep fighting. Our intersecting communities depend on it. Even this week, I can see the severity of transphobia and the murderous intent in the base of the parties, not just of the right, but of the centre and centre-left as well, specifically in terms of the British and American transphobia that's making its way across the rest of the world. We've got work to do. If we want a full legal ban on conversion therapy that includes all LGBTQIA+ people, then those sold for autistic conversion should be included in that ban. Ban conversion therapy, whatever it chooses to brand itself as. Say yes to community, say no to Autism Speaks, say no to ABA. We can and should do better. Read instead. So I think I went over a little bit. Cultural paradigm shift, yeah, we don't have time for that. This is my close community. Chris is here, Harry can't make it, Luke's there. All of these people are autistic and they're my closest friends. And yeah, don't light it up blue this April. If you support autistic people, go red instead, or light it up gold for autism acceptance. And now, 5-minute break. Thank you for your attention. Make sure you get back in 5 minutes. We'll stop the recording. I'm going to drink some water because I'm parched. And